Please join me in welcoming to the stage Sienna Miller.
Hi.
I wanted to start by asking you about when you first got the script and first started reading through, what really struck you in terms of how it was such a distinct and unique piece of writing?
It sort of, first of all, she really jumped off the page and the dialogue was fantastic, which is the thing that I always tend to look for. But most importantly, it was an opportunity to be what felt like three very different women throughout the film. And that, as a challenge as an actor, was just, it was unlike anything I'd ever done before. And on that scope, it felt like an odyssey. It felt like a very big undertaking. It was funny. I found her really funny. And obviously deeply moving, and the opportunity to potentially earn respect from the beginning of the film, what you assume is not how you feel at the end. And that's the roles that we all hope for, I think.
Were there any hesitations that you had before signing on, or was it an easy role to say yes to?
It was really easy to say yes to, and then when I got the part, I was praying that it would fall apart, because I just I suddenly was like, what have I done? This is far too much. And then I think that the notion of sitting in a space and imagining a child missing was just too unbearable. Yeah.
And the film actually pushed back by about 8 months at one point when it initially lost financing.
Thrilled, yeah. I was like, come on. It's, as we all know with independent cinema, it's so hard for these things to kind of come together and stay together. And so it went through, I think, a couple of iterations of financiers and ended up in the right place. And of course, once we started, I was thrilled, but I just think the notion of saying those words, I miss my daughter, having a daughter of my own, I just, and meeting people who have lost children, and that part of it was just agony. Yeah.
And as you were mentioning, you did have a lot of conversations with parents who had gone through this unfortunate experience, but what were some of the things that you brought from those conversations into your performance in the film?
Well, there was one woman who the film is dedicated to her son, who's called Tommy Kelly, and she was really my person on the end of the phone at any given moment. So before scenes that kind of related to that aspect of the film, I would call her, and she would be so generous. She would very generously tell me about what her experience was finding him, or where he was found, and I would kind of mimic those responses, or I think deeply empathize with having a first-hand experience of that to use in the moment. And then another man that I spoke to who'd lost a son told me the story, and I said, I can't imagine what that would be like. And he said, you can, and you have, and that's exactly what it is. And that was a very generous piece of information.
The structure of the film is also so interesting because it is about a woman who's lost her child, but that really isn't at the forefront of the story for a lot of the scenes following. So how did that inform the way that you were going to perform it? Because we still catch all these inflections and emotional moments underneath in all the layers that you give her.
Well, obviously at the beginning, I wanted her to be this kind of chaotic thing that never stops moving, like a completely, like way too much what is going on, so that by the end, when I could be still, it would kind of resonate. And I think that the shock had to kick in a way, from a performance perspective, physically. So, and also I think if you don't know what happened to somebody you love, that grief or that agony or anxiety is never far away. And it never was. People have asked me in the past what happened, when you get home, how did you unwind? And I really didn't, because I needed to hold on to it, but I got to go home to my daughter. Yeah.
It seems like one of the unique challenges in this role as well is the fact that we're jumping through these different periods of time, but the way in which you play Deborah, we have such a sense of the backstory in between. So how did you think about the way that you were going to bring that to screen and make sure it never felt like a non-linear experience?
You just hope that you get it right, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I had the most phenomenal supporting cast around me and an amazing director who was mapping it out, but obviously because it was an independent film, we weren't always shooting in sequence, so I had to kind of hop between what I really think of as three Debs. So chapter 1, 2, 3, and I had a color-coded script and I highlighted lines in different colors, so I had some association, all those things that you hope will, help. And made very distinct choices of the differences between the three chapters. So number 1, just never stop moving. Number 2, shocked, and number 3, grounded in some way. And how that could represent wisdom or growing wisdom whatever you're trying to show. But it was a lot of work, but I loved it. Yeah. I like work.
It seems like it must have added an extra layer to shooting out of sequence, which is a very common thing, but just because you are essentially playing these 3 different versions of her. Do you find for yourself that things like costume and hair and makeup and the ways that we physically see her transform really helped you to know where you were emotionally in the story?
Yeah, 1,000%. Yeah. And especially the kind of pre-Bridget going missing version, the fashion is really intense, obviously. I mean, she's not holding back. And so it speaks volumes when you see the clothes she's wearing at the end. You know, that's everything that we do in film, everybody we work with is an enormous part of what is reflected. And everybody involved in this was completely fantastic.
Yeah. And you guys were really fortunate for an independent film to have a 2-week rehearsal period. So what were some of the important aspects and moments of Deborah and her story that you found through that time that you spent together?
Well, Jake very generously, which doesn't often happen, had given us all a backstory that was for us individually and never to be shared with anybody else. And so I remember in mine, it was a lot to do with the relationship with my father, who we don't really hear much about or meet, who was really, I think, the only person in Deborah's mind that understood her. Yeah. So that's kind of where the brittleness comes with Amy Madigan, my mother. And then we just talked about the moments that are kind of in reference in the script. Mm-hmm. A teenage pregnancy, the response to the people in the town, how that would make you defensive. Mm-hmm. All of the work that we would do on our own, but so refreshing to have a director who was wanting to do that with me and us, having been on films where the budget is way, way higher and find myself on day one having never spoken to the actor that I'm about to sort of be in love with or something. Yeah. It was quite refreshing, yeah.
And you also, in that 2-week rehearsal period, because you were shooting on location, were kind of already physically in the space. So how did the time that you spent with the rest of the cast outside of just the work time really help inform the chemistry that we see on screen?
It really helped that we all got along. And I find this on smaller films because you know that everybody's there and not getting paid. Yeah. And they're there because they love it, that no one's, everybody's sort of much more familial. It feels like you're integrated in a way that you aren't always. So we'd have pizza night at Kath's and beers and my house and do all of those things that you see in the film. And then there was a curry house, I think, in Brockton or somewhere that we go to. Me and Jake are English, so we love curry. Jake would have Sunday lunch at his house. I think for the first week was involved, and then as we got closer, I was more isolated, which I think was really useful, albeit not as fun. Yeah. But, you know, during the day, me and Christina and Amy would all share a little house on the block where our houses were as our trailer thing. And I'd cook food for everyone at lunch, and it just had that energy. Yeah. But I think because of the strength of the script, it would have happened anyway. Mm-hmm. It was just all there. And Jake is a director who really let us improvise and play, and Christina who let me hit her over the head when I felt like it and whack her on the bum and all of those things the playful things. I also grew up in a family with my mother and my sister, so that dynamic of 3 women was not unfamiliar.
Yeah. And in terms of relationships on screen, watching you and Christina Hendricks is one of the most enjoyable relationships to see, and the chemistry that you guys have together, even down to the way that you very specifically play siblings, with Deborah being the younger of the 2 and the way that Christina is kind of more in charge of things and trying to control everything. Mm-hmm. So how did you guys set about creating that and thinking about what that dynamic would be?
You know, something happened on the first day that we met, which was Jake said to her and I'd like you to do a little exercise where you 2 go upstairs and you put makeup on each other like you might have done when you were kids. And inside I was dying. I was like, it's one of those things that directors, and it would probably have been very useful, but I was just like, I was mortified. And she, and I was like, yeah, of course, great, English. And she said, Jake, to be honest, I think that's going to make us feel more uncomfortable. And I was like, I love you forever. And that was really it. She bailed me out in that big sister way. And from that moment on, I remember I put my head on her beautiful boobs and snuggled in. And that was it. It was just the role was cast and it just happened. She's also astounding. She can do anything. I don't know if you've seen Toy Story 4, but that creepy little doll voice is maybe one of her finest performances as well. She can do anything. And I loved her, and I loved Amy, and so that just. But the relationship between women and families, as I'm sure many of us know, is loaded with love and conflict. At least that's my experience, and the subtext of that dynamic was really important and worked on hard.
Yeah. Did you have any access to Brad Inglesby, who wrote the script for this, to ask him questions as well about his intentions for Deborah?
Brad was on set a lot. He was around, and his wife is from Aston. So I think that's where that element of it came from. I think Deborah was initially supposed to be a man, but got changed, thankfully. Yeah. And specific things about, any questions I had, he would be available to ask. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I know that I would talk to him a lot. Yeah.
Are there any specific things that you like to do for yourself when you're mastering an accent? Because this one's obviously incredibly specific.
Really hard, this one. I have this dialect coach called Tim Monarch, who has a library of thousands of voices of women from wherever. And so I phoned him and said, I have to be from here. And he would send me 5 recordings, and I'd find the one that I like the sound of, and then have that in my headphones walking around everywhere. And that's where I begin normally, is with an accent, because by the time you start, you want to not be thinking at all about it. But this one was really hard because to me it sounded initially almost Southern, which it's not at all, but that like "oh" sound was just like, I was like "oh" all day. Poster, like trying to say these words. And then it just landed. I had a phonetic script. I mean, I really worked on it. And we had this amazing woman, Wendy Overly, who was on set monitoring if it went too far or too south.
Yeah. And in terms of your character and the places that you had to go, it seems like it was so challenging emotionally and physically. What were the things that Jake would do as a director to really create an environment that made you feel safe and comfortable enough to go to those places all the time?
You know, in the past when I've had to do emotional stuff, I've sometimes battled with finding it really difficult to ask for the space that you need on a set. I'm just a people pleaser in that way. And so if people are messing around or on their phones or having a laugh about something, I don't want to dampen that because I need whatever other energy. And so it often would require me in the corner with headphones and cigaros and really like working myself into some kind of, or trying to focus and hoping that people would notice that was happening. But what Jake did was set the tone at the beginning of the day, each day, for the mood of the scene, which was, I think, which I now realize is, that's the job of a director, right? To enable, to enable an actor the space to do what they are able to do. And as a result of that, it felt so respectful and so collaborative that it was moving. And I found for the first time that I didn't need any assistance in reaching for the things, and it would just happen, which was really astounding and a first that it felt that effortless. But that is a huge testament to him.
Yeah. Also, dialogue-wise, it's very rich and heavy early on, and then Deb becomes a more quiet character and introspective as we go on. Do you prepare for scenes that are more internal differently to a way that you prepare for something that's very dialogue-rich?
I mean, obviously there's more to learn. I think I knew this whole script by the time I started. And no, so much of it happens internally. It's really hard to articulate, and I wish I was better at saying it. But I think the first way that I read this was the way that it ended up being. And when you connect to something that deeply, I saw it really, really, really clearly. And it made sense. It was well constructed enough to know that silence has been earned, and you know why. It wasn't jarring. It wasn't kind of for a point. There was no low-hanging fruit in this. I really feel like at any given moment we could have tipped into melodrama or shown things that you didn't need to see that were gratuitous potentially. And it was just drafted perfectly for me. Yeah.
Because one such scene that could have tipped into melodrama but doesn't is when she finds out that her husband, played by Aaron Paul, has been cheating on her, and the way that you approach that is very calm and very measured. Why did you think it was such an important decision for that to be her response at that point in her emotional journey?
You know, what was scripted, this is one battle that it actually wasn't a battle because everybody agreed, but she was supposed to smash a glass or throw it against the wall or have some kind of histrionics that were early Deb behavior. And Jake had this glass that was rigged to crack, and it wasn't rigged right, and it didn't. And I said, I really think it's a bad idea anyway. And so I felt like the response to first Deb would have responded in that way. But by that point, she's felt so much, she's been through so much that it's just like, are you kidding me? Like, and you think this is gonna shake me to my core? You stupid idiot, get out, you know. But it's not like, which is always fun to act. So it made sense. It just made sense, and everybody, I think, was really relieved that we did it that way. Yeah.
And then another scene, very similarly, when she goes to visit the killer of her daughter, I read that you actually filmed an entire 10-minute scene, so that wasn't the original intent for it, and then it did have more of a conversation. Yeah. What was that process of shooting that scene, and then how did that feel to do some of the best work and have it
my
not
whole
appear on
life
screen?
that is not in the film? Familiar, quite frankly. No, that was brutal, and again, Jake didn't tell me who was playing the part of the killer. I didn't know who he was. I'd never seen him. And it was in a real jail. And we shot that in sequence from me entering into that room. And then that beep happens, the door opening sound, and I started shaking just because, well, obviously because it was intense, but I'd imagined this person in my mind. I had an image, as you would have done. Yeah. And this person that walked in was nothing like what I imagined, which is, of course, what would happen. And it was awful what he said. He said, he told everything that had happened, and all Deb says is, then what happened? Then what happened? She's so strong in that moment, and a tear falls, but she doesn't let him see. And and it was brutal. But Jake said, when you see where Bridget's found, you know what happened. You know exactly what happened, and that's what happened. There was a moment where he said she fought back and she hurt me, and it was scripted that she's so proud or smiles or something, and it was really beautiful. But after we shot that scene, the poor man playing the killer just broke down completely. Yeah, he had a meltdown, poor man. Yeah. And then came out for dinner, and I could not be anywhere near him. I was like, please just get him away. Couldn't look at him. He kept trying to pass me poppadoms. I was like, thank you. No. I think I left that dinner a bit early. Yeah.
On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the scene kind of earlier in Deb's journey when her husband's being very violent towards her in the home. And could you talk a little bit about just the physicality of shooting that scene and some of the mechanics of it?
We didn't really rehearse. We couldn't rehearse with the real scrambled egg orange juice moment because we didn't have the time to redress whatever we would have to redress. And Pat Healy is an amazing actor, and I think did a fantastic job playing Ray, and was understandably really nervous about that moment. I was just gunging for it. I couldn't wait because I knew I got to hit him over the head with a cast iron pan that was in fact rubber for the hit. But it's amazing when something's that physical and you're being attacked and you're acting, but it's happening and your body doesn't really know the difference. It was really intense, but I saw that as the moment where she shifts. That was, from all of the kind of ghost-like existence that she's been in and one foot in front of the other, she reclaims a sense of self with that frying pan bit at the end. And so I was really excited about that day. I don't know, I felt really weirdly satisfied having been covered in scrambled eggs and orange juice, screamed at and called names. I was like, at the end of the day, I was like, oh, what a great day. Such a weird job, yeah. I love him getting shoved out of the door. That might be my favorite moment. Into the bush, yeah. Good old Terry. Yeah.
One of the other moments where we really see her starting to exert a lot of control is when she's gone back to school and she's in the workforce. And we see her really becoming a mentor figure to women around her, which was really lovely to watch. Is that something that you've experienced for yourself in the industry, or has it kind of eschewed you a little bit because you have worked in so many male-dominated spaces?
I have worked predominantly in male-dominated spaces. I think we all have, and I'm really. I think it's fantastic that that's changing, and we are all advocating for that shift. I don't see myself in that way necessarily. I do feel more. I think because of what's happening in the world and in our industry at large, I feel more empowered, and I feel more confident, or just less frenetic somehow. That if something doesn't feel right, I would stand up to it, and if somebody is looking for advice, I am available. But I haven't had that kind of a scene where I'm mentoring people in that way. I think that there is an army of women who are together at last for the first time, supporting each other, and that's never happened in my experience. And that solidarity is very, very empowering.
Yeah. But one of the ways in which that's happening is through Time's Up, which you've been incredibly involved in and put a lot of time and effort into. So I would love if you could just talk a little bit about, for you, kind of the importance of using the platform that you have to give voices to underrepresented women within the industry in that way.
I feel like I should have done more than I've done, which is always the way. But I was fortunate enough to be at some of the very, very early first Time's Up meetings, which were so it was like Avengers Assemble, not me, but I was witnessing sort of Meryl Streep, and we were in someone's house, and it was, what are the things that are wrong and how do we start to rectify them? What was the second part of your question? I can't remember.
It's just really about the importance for you in using your platform to help bring voices to underrepresented women through organizations such as Time's Up.
Obviously, the Legal Defence Fund has been astounding, and I think it's very easy in our very privileged position to feel hard done by, and certainly our industry is completely out of whack and has been for way too long. But it's really important to remember that in the scheme of things, we're all really fine. And so what that fund has done is astounding and important. And to fundraise for that is easy and necessary. If you have a voice, I think it's essential to try to do something with it. Yeah.
And then you're also starting to bring your voice to creating content and optioning properties in order to produce and potentially direct as well. Has that been something that you've been really interested in for a long time, but just looking for the right project and the right moment for yourself?
I think it's partly gendered, my hesitancy about doing it, but I was like, how can I possibly be a parent and an actor and have a life and do something else, and what are my credentials to do that? And then I realized I've made, I don't know how many films, but a lot at this point. And suddenly can sit on a set and be like, I think I know how to do this. So I think I'm in the nascent stages of imagining what that is. I am reading books to option and develop, not necessarily for myself, but to create content that would be great vehicles for female performers, male performers, but just great films, and the kind of films I like, which would probably make no money at the box office, and therefore my company will be bust in about a year. But I think in this moment of so much, there's a little corner of cinema which is potentially going to be neglected, and I want to try to support that. Films like this.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And then I know that you've also been on the business side of things through the fashion line that you put together. Is there anything that you feel like you learned through being involved in the behind the scenes business of that you feel like will really come into play as you're moving into producing?
That was a long time ago. And my sister is a designer and I'm not, but I had an aesthetic. And so it made sense as a collaboration. It's not what I want to do, design. But I think understanding a structure of a company is probably a useful skill. And at this point, having enough friends who would mentor me within the industry is essential too. I would hope to be that for someone one day as well. Yeah.
And then one of your recent roles was in The Loudest Voice playing Beth Ailes. What did it mean to get to play a role like that in the current climate, in amongst all the conversations that we're having?
Are you laughing at my big face in Beth Ailes? No. What was important about that? Well, I think there's probably nothing more important at this moment in time than to analyze the inception of Fox News, which is what that show did. Yeah. And wow. And the effect that it's having on us, and to make us ask those questions, even if it moves the needle 2 degrees for the people who voted that way, and apologies if anybody did, although I doubt it. Then that's important. That's what art should and can do. I also had a history personally with Rupert Murdoch, who hacked my phone back when that all happened in England. So I did find it fascinating to sort of be in a scene with him. It felt like being in the belly of the beast and really understanding the genius of Roger Ailes and the effect that he's had. I don't think there is a Trump without him. I think the nature of the way that political campaigns are being run is because of him. And so to kind of analyze him as a human is fascinating. Also, to play somebody completely different to myself is always what I look for. Yeah. And I couldn't be more different to Beth. Yeah. And I loved it. Yeah. And I love prosthetics. People complain about them. I've never had so much fun in my life. There's nothing like looking in the mirror and not seeing yourself, and just like the bravery. It was really liberating. Yeah.
And you've also got such a rich background in theatre acting, and I'm really interested if, when you're prepping for a role and you're creating the backstory and doing all the research, do you think about it any differently depending on whether it's a miniseries such as Loudest Voice, it's a film, or if it's a theatre piece, or is it really all the same process for you?
I think a film and a series are the same process. Yeah. The difference in theatre is that you have 5 or 6 weeks in a rehearsal room, which is what I would do all my life if I didn't have to always do the play. I would only rehearse plays, and that's probably the happiest I ever am, is in that room. But that, obviously, the amount of analysis and analysing, the analysis of text and scenario and how collaborative that process is. Most of the plays I've done, all the actors have sat in on other people's rehearsals as well, so that you're really making this thing together. And I love theatre like nothing else because it's really your own. I mean, once the director goes, it's in your hands. And the way that a play begins, the run of a play, to what it finishes up as is so drastically different and so much more realised. Yeah. And so I think what I've learned from that is that, just work on film and TV, just do all the work that you might do if you had a run of a play, because you'll keep mining and you will keep discovering. Yeah. It's not easy though. Yeah.
And then so much theatre has started being filmed and shown in cinemas, particularly in the UK, such as Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. When they're filming that specific performance, are you able to think about the fact that there's also cameras and it's going to be viewed in a very different way in terms of your performance, or do you just have to put that to the back of your mind?
Well, you can't help but know because they're right in your face, which is just not. And obviously acting on stage is vocally very different, and you're projecting, and there is still an audience, although half of it's been removed because there are cameras, and it feels really weird also because you can't modify your performance by that point. You're still in a theatre. I could never watch that filmed play. And I think they're great because you probably do get a sense of what the show was, but it's such a different thing. I found it weird, but also glad that theatre can now reach a wider audience. I think that's great.
I wanted to jump into a couple of audience questions quickly that we have from you guys. The first one is asking if there are any words of wisdom imparted to you by Michael Margota that you've applied to your career from your Strasbourg days.
Does anyone know Michael Margota? Who asked that question? No. He was my acting coach at Strasbourg, and I moved there when I was 18. I can't remember specific words of wisdom, but I do remember the rite of passage that this hideous experience which changed my life. But day one of being in the school, and I was so young and so excited to be in New York. And he went around the audience and he said, the students, and he said, what's your greatest fear? And people said, la, la, la. And I got to me and I said, I think my perception of what people think of me, I think if I could let go of that attachment, I'd probably be a better actor. And then I was shaking because I'd had to speak publicly. And he said, come down. And I said, no. And he said, get down here. He was like Arthur Miller. He had a cigarette and he was like black coat. It was like 2000, so people could still smoke inside. And I came up onto the stage and he said, dance. And I went, no. And he went, fucking dance. And I was like, oh my God. And I didn't want to, I was like, new me, new world, New York. Just jump. And I started dancing and it was silent. Then people started clapping. Then he started like bongoing on one of those black boxes. And by the end of it, I was so mortified and having to push through this mortification that by the end of it, I was totally liberated. And when it stopped, he said, now tell me that you care what they think about you. And I was like, you're right. And I didn't anymore. It was an amazing, so I can't remember parting words of wisdom, but I do remember that lesson. Yeah.
That's really great.
Yeah.
And this next one is about when you played Edie Sedgwick in Factory Girl, and how did you feel about Edie after you'd played her?
I felt deeply in love with her. I still do. I think she's such a fragile, enigmatic, like little performance artist creature. I still think about, I'm sure everyone does, but the people that you've played that really stay with you. And that was the first time that something really clicked. I think she was so damaged and fragile. And I love her and loved her through that.
Yeah. And kind of going back to American Women, now that you're on the other side of the film and it's had this life out there, what would you say was the moment that really challenged you the most as an actor that you learned about your craft from?
Oh my God. I think, what was the most challenging? The whole thing felt so enormous. And the beats of it were so challenging. How do I reflect without a huge budget and lots of aging makeup, and how do you show age? How do you show those transitions? How do you make them seamless? How is it not a caricature? Because at any moment I was tempted to often tip into or too much crying, or you lose a child. My response to that is like crying all the time, but you can't do that. You have to earn that and save it. And that there's real dignity in courage. That tends to be the thing that moves me most in film and in women, and I see it all the time. And so I think that was probably the most challenging thing, was holding that line when my instinct was sometimes to tip over, but just holding on to that. No, she's brave. That was kind of my mantra, which hopefully served me well. But that was the hardest. Yeah.
It's a really genuinely astounding performance and a wonderful film. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for coming out today.